Thank you so much for joining us for today's event, which is exploring the history and context of diversity, equity, and inclusion in today's higher education landscape. It's my greatest pleasure to introduce our speaker and dear friend, Dr. Laurie Hazard. She's a nationally recognized student success expert, award-winning author, and CEO of Recognize Your Potential. Dr. Hazard brings over 30 years of experience in higher education and currently serves as a faculty member at the New England Institute of Technology. She's also known for her innovative work on student achievement, parent involvement, and diversity initiatives, including the Student Diversity Advocates Program. And of course, her latest book, The Habits of Mind for College Success, was released earlier this year, and a new edition of her book, Your Freshman is Off to College, is coming this August. So please help me and join me in welcoming Dr. Laurie Hazard.
Thank you, Martha. So ready to take the plunge here with a couple of disclaimers. One disclaimer is I do have my dog in the background if you heard me talking about that. So hopefully she will not shake me down for treats during our discussion here. Number two is I am a fast talker. So I always tell people to strap in because I'm going to ramp up to fifth gear and get going here. And I do have a habit of trying to smush in a lot of good information in a short amount of time. So my plan is to talk for 40 minutes or so and then leave 15 or 20 minutes for some discussion around this topic. So I do want to give you a little bit of background, what kind of landed me exploring this recently is I do consulting in higher education, and I had an institution of higher education ask me to explore the current landscape. And then also, as Martha mentioned, in writing my book, which is aimed at student success, I was asked by the publisher to make sure that from my previous edition that I got rid of anything that referenced diversity, equity, and inclusion. So it was, I think what we're all going through right now in organizations and in higher education, how do I do that when this topic is so germane and important, for example, to a student's college experience and to how we function in our organization. So that's been really challenging. So I'm going to kind of talk a little bit about that process and what happened and where my co-author and I landed with how do we talk about this topic. So we're going to take the plunge. Here we go. So our goals for today is I want you to kind of reflect on your own education related to this conceptual territory. And you see all those acronyms there: diversity, equity, and inclusion, justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion, diversity, equity, and belonging, diversity, equity, inclusion, accessibility, and belonging. So there are so many kind of vocabulary words and so much lexicon around this topic that it's hard for us to even settle on how we talk about it. But for today, we're just going to use the acronym DEI to kind of encompass the conversation. So we're going to look a little bit at the history of DEI work in higher education and kind of explore, the why it's important in terms of educational degree attainment and social mobility. And as I've already alluded to, there are challenges and complexities navigating this landscape. And we're going to think about how DEI work manifests in the academy, what happens in higher education, the conversations around this topic. And then I'm not a fairy godmother. I don't have all of the answers, but I do feel like I've come up, at least in my work, with some possible responses to the current culture and climate. And hopefully we'll have some time for all of us to discuss what's going on in your own work. But as you can see from that quote, really what happens in all of our organizations and in higher education is how we talk about these topics really is a mirror or a reflection of what's going on in the external sociocultural environment of higher education. And I feel like this quote is just so much more meaningful and resonating so much more now with our current culture and climate. And that last piece of it, our country's own struggles toward becoming a more democratic nation. And it feels like there's some backsliding going on right now. So as we start this conversation, I would love to hear from all of you if you can really kind of reflect and think back on your own experience and your own education related to DEI. Maybe it was introduced in a history or social studies class in your K through 12 education, or maybe this idea, and I'm dating myself here, maybe you were of the civics class generation, and that's where this topic was discussed. So if you could chat in and just give me a little sentence or two about where did your instruction related to DEI start, and what were you told? So I'll give you a minute to chat that in. I feel like Ferris Bueller's Day Off here. Anyone? Anyone? Here we go. Yeah, that's interesting, Peter. You didn't talk about it that long ago, but maybe you did, but we were just using different vocabulary, is what I'm guessing.
Yes, that's exactly right. That's
Yeah.
exactly right. I think the first time was in an African American studies class that I took, where I was in the minority, and it was a really interesting.
So your intro to the topic was in college.
Yeah, literally. Yeah.
Okay, so let's kind of take a look at how we've talked about this topic through the decades. So I know my entree into the topic was, I was taught in school that we should view it through the lens of a melting pot, that all of these different diverse peoples are coming together in one culture, and we're going to all meld together, right, and live harmoniously. And then what happens is scholars come along and they question what we come to know, right, our knowing. And then scholars came along and said, well, no, we can't think of it like a melting pot. We've got to think of it like a salad bowl, that different cultures are going to come together and they're going to retain some of their identities, but we're still all going to mix together, right, and get along. And then there was this organization, the Southern Poverty Law Center, which is still pretty active. And they that term teaching tolerance kind of was the language that permeated the landscape. And then scholars came along and said, well, we can't use the word tolerate. That doesn't sound so great, right? So we're going to think about appreciating differences. And then it evolved to, I know when I developed curricula in colleges and universities, we wanted to talk about it as appreciating diversity and respecting diversity. And then it evolved into diversity, awareness and inclusion, and then all the things, all the acronyms that I was talking about earlier in the introduction. And now if you look at the Association of Colleges and Universities, the American Association of Colleges and Universities, they have what are called value rubrics, right? And some of you, if you're in higher ed, may be familiar with this, but we've really moved on to talking about maybe we should think about it in terms of intercultural knowledge and competence, or global learning, and kind of widen our viewpoint of this conversation. So I think you can see like where we've been in the landscape, that it's just an ongoing conversation. In higher education, we call it a Burkean parlor, where scholars are invited in to have ongoing conversations about these topics, and topics evolve because of what we come to know through research and practice. So we're going to reflect a little bit here on the history of diversity, equity, and inclusion work, and I'm just going to share a timeline with you. If you can see, I know the lettering is a little small there, but affirmative action was really what had the impact on accessibility to secondary education, accessibility to higher education. And you can kind of take a look at the enrollment patterns based on what happened after affirmative action. So if you see that in the 1970s, minority enrollment in higher ed was around 15%, right? In 2016, white students made up about 57% of enrollment, but it is ticking up, right? In 2022, we began to see an uptick in racial and ethnic minority enrollment. And so I wanted you to just kind of take a look at bachelor's degree or higher trends. And of course, we want to think about educational attainment for bachelor's degrees because we know very clearly from the research that if somebody has access to higher education and earns their bachelor's degree over the lifespan, they're going to have much higher earnings. So, why is it important for people to have access to higher education and earn their bachelor's degrees? Because of that social mobility factor. And this idea that some people haven't had access to it, and how can we help them gain access? So I just wanted to, I'm just going to step back for about 15 seconds or so and have you take a look at current enrollment surges and trends. And then I circled one bullet because what's happening in our current culture and climate now. Students aren't wanting to report their racial identity in fall of 2024, and that's important for student success and retention reasons. So I'll just give you a second to take a look at that. Before these current enrollment trends, there was fear in higher education that there was going to be a demographic cliff where not as many students were planning on pursuing higher education. And the Northeast was identified as one area where there was going to be a real enrollment decline, but the latest data is telling us in this fall, there was a rise by 4.7%. And I would just, encourage you to check out the article from Inside Higher Education where some of this data is from. So I think the concern and question for those of us in higher education is students may be enrolling, but what happens during those 4 years? And we know that colleges and universities don't always do the best job of retaining underrepresented students. And so the perennial question for all of us in higher education is, how can we ensure that students are going to actually retain those degrees as they're moving from matriculation to graduation? And when do students stop out? First year, second year, third year, and why do they stop out? And there's so much data and research in this area. We know that retention rates for first to second year students nationally at state universities really vary widely. Our own state university, the University of Rhode Island, actually has a pretty good first to second year retention rate at 83%. But if you look across the country, you'll see first to second year retention rates in like the 50s and 60s in some of the public universities. So here's some more recent data in terms of college attainment. And again, you can see that it's on the rise, but we've got so much work to do in this space, and we're going to explore some reasons why that might happen with students. So again, we say, why is this area of inquiry so important, right? And so we've talked about how the conversation is around diversity, equity, and inclusion, but there's been a lot of conversation around this idea of ableism and access. And when we talk about ableism, in very simple terms, it's the exploration of the idea that the world is set up for example, neurotypical people, not neurodiverse individuals. So on the left-hand side, when we talk about access to learning, a lot of the conversation in the higher ed landscape is about how do we give access to learning to all of our learners? And I think that cartoon there captures it really well. So I'll let you just take a look at that. So in terms of instructional design, there's a lot of conversation about how do we make classroom work, right, testing accessible to all learners. And on the right-hand side, what's interesting is you can see how this graphic has evolved over the years. We used to see conversations about equality and then equity. And then the last one, accessibility. So those images I think are really powerful. And I will just share with you that I did a talk for a national organization around something called Universal Design for Learning. And Universal Design for Learning is this idea of creating programs, curricula, services for all learners. And we were asked to take this image out of our presentation. Yeah, so there's this tension of, as an educator, you want to get the information, you want to get the instruction to people, but you also want to stay true to your authenticity and your integrity. And how it's all of us right now. How are we navigating that tension? So here's some of the advice, right, for best practices for all organizations. We need funding for DEI. So the recommendation is funding for DEI. And if you think of your organizations, funding for DEI in your organizations. Centering DEI in core values. In the academy, the core of the academy is faculty and instruction. So you can imagine the diversity of faculty and the different content areas. It's hard for the folks that are doing DEI work on campus because they might get faculty pushback. Faculty might ask a question like, well, how do I integrate DEI into a statistics course? So there's sometimes immediate walls that get put up in the academy about this because of that feeling of know-how, right? You've got all of these experts who are experts in their field, and then they're being asked to integrate a topic that they don't 100% feel comfortable with. And so the immediate response is defensiveness. And that's why in terms of integrating this into pedagogy or teaching, it's been challenging. And the idea and what colleges and universities have been trying to do for many years is to involve all stakeholders. And I don't know if you've heard this term, communities of practice. The idea of communities of practice comes out of anthropology. There's an anthropologist named Etienne Wenger, who kind of coined this term, communities of practice. And the idea is to create communities of practice around topics that we all feel are important and that we're passionate about. And we want to be change agents, but to involve everybody in the organization in these communities of practice to kind of move the needle in these areas. But we know that DEI efforts have been threatened on campuses across the country and in organizations. And I just want to point out that a lot of times when we do DEI work in institutions of higher education, what happens is a department is adopted. Like years ago in the 80s, women's centers started cropping up around colleges and university campuses. And then centers for diversity, equity, and inclusion are popping up around campuses all over the country. But the issue with that is that those centers are on the margins, right? They're in the co-curricular experience of the students. They're not in the curricular experience of the students. So if we kind of go back to this image, right? So we've got the curricular experience, access to learning, and then the co-curricular experience, everything that happens outside. And most of the work in DEI has been marginalized to the co-curricular experience. So that's why it's been such a challenge. And if you look across the higher education landscape, DEI offices and programs and services, they vary so widely. I'm doing a book right now on parent involvement in higher education, and we're doing this chapter on looking at the programs and services that support diversity, equity, and inclusion. And we're like, what are we going to call it? Because at every college and university, those departments are called different things. So how do we get parents to understand how their students, if they're from an underrepresented group, can get support when we can't even figure out across the higher ed landscape what we're calling these departments? Here's some very recent research in terms of the landscape related to DEI, and 118 colleges and universities participated in this research. There's a lot on this slide, so I'm going to step back for about 30 seconds and allow you to kind of process it and take a look at it.
Laurie, quick question here. What year did you say this survey took place?
This one is 2022.
Thank you.
So when we talk about patterns in terms of educational attainment, right? So we've got a rise of first-year students coming into the academy from different racial and ethnic groups, and that's positive, right? The rise in the number of students coming to their first-year experience. But if you look at what I've circled there, only about half of colleges and universities are looking at patterns of retention, persistence, graduation rates. That's a pretty powerful stat right there, right? And about only half the schools were looking at their data to kind of really figure out this big question of what's happening with these students if they're not getting from their first to second year and actually graduating. And there is this trend in higher education to use data-driven approaches. And here's one of my criticisms of the academy is we don't always rely on professional practice knowledge of those who are in the trenches working with these students. So we don't always use that qualitative data to inform the quantitative data. And I think we can get better at that. But students are dropping out along those 4 years, and there are some pretty clear reasons for that. So here's just some research on diverse populations. So again, for those who attend college, their participation rates decrease at multiple points across that pipeline. And you can see the disparities at graduation rates. So though we might be closing the gap at the students going to college at the first year, those other students are dropping out, and we've got an issue with that, and colleges and universities have to get better at figuring out why, and then creating support systems to help those students stay in, right? So it's beyond getting in. So there's a call for an equity imperative, and there has been a call for an equity imperative for many years. And here's what happens. These students get to our colleges and universities, but if we look at participation rates with all of the support systems, so if you think about support systems in colleges and universities like academic advising, career services, co-curricular activities, student engagement, clubs and organizations, participating in tutoring, going to accessibility services if they know they've been diagnosed with a learning disability. More students from privileged backgrounds seek out those services. So we have to ask the question, why don't underrepresented students or first-generation college students seek out those services? And what can we do to get them connected into the pipeline in a way that they feel supported? There is this idea that students think, why should I use those services even though they're free to me? They expect credit for it, right? And they underrepresented and first generation students don't have their parents to go to and say, hey, what service should I use if I'm having challenges with X, Y, or Z? If their parents haven't gone to college, they don't know how to respond to their students when they're asking those questions. First generation students, underrepresented students may be working 20 or 30 hours a week, so that prevents them from participating in these services. So then we can get into the whole question about they need to be supported financially through student loans and financial aid and scholarships. So this permeates big areas of the academy. And we just do know from research that the students who don't take advantage of these services and programs that help with retention and success, they're the first generation students and minority students. So we might ask, why is this going on? So there is a lot of research in the space of culture shock, and all college students experience that culture shock because it's a new experience. And so what happens with college students is at the beginning of their experience, they're in the honeymoon stage, right? It's all exciting and new. And then around week 3 or 4, and if you think about sort of the rhythm of a college semester at week 3 or 4, when tests and quizzes and homework assignments start ramping up, that's when culture shock hits, right? And so they're feeling homesick and they're feeling all of these pull factors that are taking them away from their coursework and their academics. So I think it's really important for colleges and universities to find somewhere in the curriculum, and many colleges and universities have what's called a first year experience program where they take a psychoeducational approach and talk to students about culture shock, but it doesn't always happen. So for first gen and underrepresented students, they will see vast differences between high school and college and the way the curriculum is delivered. And there might be nobody there to help them close that gap of that hidden curriculum. For example, in high school, students are told, here's what you have to do for homework. In college, students have to look at their syllabus and figure out the homework assignments from their syllabus. And if you think of a first generation students, they might hear the word syllabus. So we're back to culture shock. They don't know the language and they don't want to ask anybody about it because they feel like an imposter, right? So there's so much evidence that first year college students experience imposter syndrome, but it is exacerbated with underrepresented students and first generation college students. And they really have to have self-advocacy skills when they're going in. So when you think about that, where in the curriculum are self-advocacy skills being taught, that ability to ask for help? And we know the I generation, the generation who uses these things, their self-advocacy skills have really regressed. But I want to talk about imposter syndrome because I think that's the issue that's most related to this idea of diversity, equity, and inclusion. So I just love this quote by Mike Myers, if you remember him from Saturday Night Live. He says, "I still believe that at any time the no talent police will come and arrest me." And we all experience imposter syndrome a little bit. Like when Martha was doing my little announcement there, I'm like, oh my God, what gives me the right to be talking about this? Like you have those moments of feeling like, I'm competent, but should I be doing this, right? We all have those experiences. And think about emergent adults and how they feel when they're in this new place and space. So colleges and universities recognize this. So they think, okay, we have to do something to help these students feel like they belong, right? To combat that feeling of imposter syndrome. But this idea of belonging is really complex. So I'm going to let you read that quote because I think it's powerful and it really gets at the heart of what we're talking about here. I would encourage you to think about times when you felt like an imposter, right? And that need and want and feeling to belong. And I always think of when I was in college, we were reading The Old Man and the Sea by Ernest Hemingway in a literature class. And the conversation got around this idea of the Christian symbolism in The Old Man and the Sea. And, it was like Christ carrying the cross when the old man was carrying the mass, dragging the mass. And all these students are raising their hands talking about it. And I'm sitting there like, oh my God, I don't belong here. I have no idea what they're talking about. I feel stupid now. And I was a pretty competent student. So it happens. And it can happen a lot for underrepresented and first gen students, and that creates barriers to their learning and they start to sort of pull away from the learning experience. So there's been a lot of work in this space, really getting colleges and universities to recognize that students have to feel like they have this sense of belonging. So lots of research, lots of literature in this space. And we know very clearly in the student success area that giving students, cultivating a sense of belonging is absolutely essential to academic success. And as I've said repeatedly, if you look at that third bullet, first generation college students face additional challenges related to feeling like they belong and feeling like they're significant on a college campus. We look at the research and there are very clearly objective measures. If you look at the top, say, 5 things that create retention and success factors, one of the top is that sense of belonging and acceptance. The second piece is self-regulatory behaviors. And the constellation of self-regulatory behaviors are the ability to manage time and behavior, the ability to combat procrastination, the ability to self-motivate when you don't feel like doing something, and goal setting. So if we say there's 100% of factors that create college success, one of them, the top one always emerges sort of is that sense of belongingness and acceptance. And then that second piece, those self-regulatory behaviors account for about 35% variance in college success. So if students are feeling overwhelmed, what's going to shut down first? It's those self-regulatory behaviors. So then scholars started coming around and talking about, okay, we have to really validate these students. So in the 90s, there was this upsurge in research around validating students. And Rendon was, one of the scholars who really said, we have to figure out a way to confirm and support students in and outside of the classroom and foster the academic engagement and personal development. And now the conversation has moved to, we have to go on beyond equity, we have to go beyond belonging, we have to go beyond inclusion. And the conversation in businesses and organizations and in higher education has moved to this idea of mattering and enabling people to feel significant. And I've done some work with Zach Mercurio, who wrote this book, and his book just came out, The Power of Mattering. I haven't read it yet, but I can read the tea leaves since I've been in this field for so long. I can see that this is where the conversation is going to start. We're going to start talking about mattering, like how do we do this in our curriculum, program, services. So for any organization, right, how do we do this in our professional development, in the events we have, as we're evaluating our employees, or as we're looking at how we measure student success, how do we measure mattering? So we think about that, right, in programs and organizations. There's a perennial question in curriculum, and that's what's going on in K through 12 education all over the country right now, and in higher education. And if we think about, if we're somebody who's in charge of professional development, we have to make this decision of what is most worth knowing in this conceptual territory, and what kind of information do we want to get to our individuals, because really what we're talking about, right, is creating behavior change in human beings, and that is very hard to create behavior change. And as I said, in the academy, the curriculum is central, because otherwise all of the conversations about DEI and mattering and belonging are going to happen in pockets around the institution, but the central core of higher ed is the curriculum. So there has been a lot of conversation about how we integrate DEI into courses, but I will tell you now the conversation is we're going to keep integrating these concepts into courses, because we know that that is worth knowing for students, but we can't use the term DEI. So what are our workarounds? And of course, this goes to academic freedom. And so some institutions are just going to continue staying in the course and doing what they're doing and use the language, and other institutions are sort of in fear of the repercussions for that. So they're trying to think about workarounds. Where the conversation starts in the academy, in teaching, is usually in these first-year experience courses. So about 75% of colleges and universities have what's called a first-year experience course. It's a psychology of adjustment course, really, and you will see developing a sense of belongingness for students, or creating a purpose for students, and creating an appreciation for students related to diversity, equity, and inclusion. You'll see that as a stated curricular outcome in these courses. But again, that is one course in the entire curriculum. So there's been this movement to get faculty to integrate DEI into all of their courses. And these are just some guiding questions that we might ask faculty, right? How can all faculty members encourage and value diverse knowledge? What do we do about racist texts if we want an anti-racist classroom? So these are questions that Centers for Teaching and Learning have been asking and encouraging. And there are some models out there, some universities that really had this down pat, but now they're having to rethink how they do this in our current culture and climate. I've had some conversations with folks locally. There is a school in our state. This is the state of Rhode Island. They had a Center for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, and just this year they changed the name to the Center for Belonging. So they took DEI out of the title of the center, and I have heard the graduating seniors are in an uprising about this. So that's what's happening at one institution. At another institution, a lot of the conversations about DEI come out of their human resources, and they're having conversations about whether we should stay the course here. So that tension of staying the course, doing the good work that we do, using the terminology, but then others are saying, like, let's get the terminology out so we're not going to experience backlash, but we can still continue to do the good work. So those are just two examples from two institutions of higher education here in the state of Rhode Island, and it's happening all over the country. So I want to go back to the basics a little bit. I'm going to give you 1 minute of think time, and I want you to write down what your definition of diversity is. And you can put it in the chat, you can write it down on a piece of paper, you can talk to the person next to you and say what your definition of diversity is, how you would define it. Okay, we're at 1 minute, so let's take a look. So in terms of curriculum at many colleges and universities, there's this big discussion about how do we have these conversations with students. And I always found this an effective way to have entree into the conversation, because one of the challenges and the complexities of this idea is that we can never come up with a definition of it that we all sort of agree on. So this is a way to get students to start thinking about diversity. And we know a lot of college students and first-year students live in this area of the benign difference perspective of diversity. You know, if you try to start talking to them about it, they'll say, oh, you know, I'm from Warwick, she's from Cranston, or I play soccer, she plays lacrosse. So they live in this benign difference. And in order to get all students to have that sense of belongingness and acceptance, we've got to push students past that benign definition, right? I think most of us live in this space when we think about the definition of diversity as it relates to equity, as it relates to those social justice issues and those dimensions of diversity, right? Race, gender, ableism, culture, all of those dimensions of diversity. But I think where the conversation needs to be, right, is the behavioral part, because like I said, what we're trying to get individuals to do is engage in behavioral change as it relates to working and living and being in communities with others. So I encourage institutions and organizations to think about, how do you perform diversity and what can we do to perform diversity? You know, when we think of college students, we might have conversations here around bystander intervention, right? That's a way to perform diversity. Or if you see something, say something. And my guess is most of you, when you were thinking about your definition of diversity, you were living in this conceptual territory as you think about it. So what are some alternative potential responses to today's culture and climate, and how can we talk to individuals in our organizations and students if we're pressured to kind of take out the idea of using this language that seems to be fraught with controversy and complexities? So I think one way to approach it is to talk about it in relationship to emotional intelligence. Right, really what we're talking about here is emotional intelligence. because what we want is people to develop intrapersonal skills and ask the question, how well do I know myself? Right? That's a dimension of emotional intelligence, getting to know yourself really well and how your behaviors affect other people around you. So that includes acknowledging your own bias and privilege. We can also think about the intersection of diversity, equity, and inclusion with internationalization, right? That we're in a global economy. As a college student, as an employee of an organization, you are going to need to know how to navigate and move in and out of different cultures. So we can talk about it in terms of cultural competence and cultural intelligence. So we're going to talk about how we might use restorative practices to engage in courageous conversations, how you might use empathy to resolve conflicts, and where a lot of this conversation, again, lives in colleges and universities, are in these student success spaces and these first-year experience courses. When you kind of dive into the literature, if we really simplify this, really it's that golden rule, right? You want to treat others how others treat you. And you want to lead in all of your actions and behaviors with empathy. So if we can empower students to think about it in that way, I think it kind of dissipates some of the tension around it. So this is just what I might use with students as a self-assessment guide to get them to begin the process, right, of acknowledging their own biases and privileges. And, we're not using the word diversity, equity, and inclusion here, but getting them to really kind of, I would say, situate yourself on a social map, right? Think about what you had access to while you were growing up, and think about others that may have not had the same access to goods and services and education. And then get students to kind of acknowledge that there's an intersection between the idea of diversity, equity, and inclusion and internationalization. There's a good chance that you are going to be, if you get your bachelor's degree, right, that you're going to be traveling for work, that you are going to have to move in and out of different cultures. And how you navigate that is a dimension of cultural intelligence. And the good news is that everybody can learn how to be more culturally intelligent. So in colleges and universities right now, there's a movement toward this idea of intercultural competence and knowledge and what it means to be a global citizen, and really looking at how these areas on colleges and universities can collaborate. So maybe creating communities of practice around DEI and global education. Again, just like there are different views of diversity, equity, and inclusion and what the term diversity means, there are different views of what cultural competence means. So here's where I started diving into this. Instead of using the word diversity, equity, and inclusion in the chapter of my new book, I am now using the language of cultural competence. So what does that mean, right? The need for people to function productively together. Think about positive outcomes in a workplace or in a group project at a college or university if people can function productively together. The golden rule, treating people how you want to be treated, accepting that everybody's different. And now, guess what? The pendulum is swinging back to the promotion of tolerance. So again, the pendulum swinging in the other direction. And how do we foster that inclusive environment? And I guarantee you the discussion is going to start being built around that idea of mattering and how do we make people feel like they matter. So what can we do? We can take a performative view and think about our behaviors. And in order to think about your behaviors, you have to have moral courage. So I do a lot of talking in my classes with students about what does it mean to have moral courage, right? And in order to perform diversity, you have to sit in a place of discomfort. And how are we going to create a culture of respect so that every member of the community, the classroom, the organization can feel respected? How do we get students to understand that their voice matters? And how do we engage and foster that kind of environment where everybody feels respected and included? So I start out with teaching about cultural intelligence. And I don't know if you're familiar, this is David Livermore's work. And so there's a good short inventory to get students to get their CQ score and get them really to think about what CQ means, right? So there's drive, your level of motivation for wanting to participate in this hard work. Your CQ knowledge, understanding cultural similarities and differences, CQ strategy, preparing yourself for multicultural interactions and what that's going to look like, and then your behavior, right? How do you adapt moving in and out of these cultural contexts? And I think for business students in particular, because I worked at a university where there were a ton of business students, this is really motivating for them to think about how can I really get to a place where I can show leadership in this area. And it motivates them in terms of their career planning. There is a wonderful TED Talk that I would recommend to all of you. This is another theory of cultural intelligence. Julia Middleton talks about there are two components to cultural intelligence, and she talks about it in terms of core and flex. And your core is what you're not willing to compromise as a human being, that you will not adjust, right? Those core values that you have. And so when I was thinking about redoing that chapter, it was hurting, right, to kind of get the DEI language out. But my core is to still get this good work and information to everyone. So I was willing to flex a little bit and think of other ways to give individuals access to thinking about how we get everybody to feel like they belong and they matter. She talked about traveling to a country where she had to wear a burqa, and she said her daughters were like, "Mom, how could you do that? How could you be in that culture and wear a burqa?" And she said, "Well, that was in my flex. The way I dress is in my flex. And that says nothing about the core of who I am, my beliefs and my behaviors." So she really does give some behavioral advice in terms of developing cultural intelligence. And that's the idea of we should all be willing to flex a little bit. And she really says it's more about understanding our own culture than the culture of the other in order to have cultural intelligence, so she kind of turns David Livermore's work on its head a little bit, where he's saying, get to learn other cultures so that you can navigate in and out. And she's saying, really, in order to do that, you have to really understand your own culture in order to do that effectively. I would recommend you taking a look at her TED Talk. So we know that conflicts will arise. So I want to norm this for students, but I want them to understand that they're going to have disagreements, but they want to approach disagreements with a tone of goodwill. And this comes out of Richard Light's work. When he says, when we think about diversity, we always want to lead with that empathy piece and just assume that everybody is coming from a good place. So if we approach conversations with a tone of goodwill, that will be helpful. And that will enable us to engage in civil discourse. And I think teaching about conflict resolution skills can help people navigate difficult conversations and have courageous conversations. And restorative practices, I think, is a place where we can start to do that. So here are just some what I might do with students or organizations in terms of conflict resolution skills, that if you always use I statements when you're up against conflict, and make sure that you're considering what the intent of the person was, and really talking about the difference between what was the intent of this conversation and here's how it impacted me, and really focus on the facts of what happened. And obviously for some people, there's discomfort around engaging in these conversations. So in as much as you can, if people aren't willing to engage in conversations openly, assure them confidentiality as they work through some of the conflicts, right? And really it's about getting to the bottom of conflict. So I think of, when I think of civil discourse in classrooms, or I think of human resources can kind of do some professional development in this area, right? And what's a mutual solution that's going to work for everyone? And how might we address these conflicts in the future? And so here is just a series of questions that you can use to kind of restore, right, peace to conversations that might be wrought with conflict. So, what happened in this situation? What were you thinking at the time? And you'll see restorative practices being used in student affairs in colleges and universities, right? If there's conflicts in the residence hall, if there's fighting at sports events, right? This is a good way to kind of help individuals work through that idea of what happened by using these restorative questions. So what some organizations are doing are trying to figure out creating some kind of certification for DEI and creating their own, if they can, modeling after some work that's going on in colleges and universities. Some businesses are doing DEI certification, but you might have to change the name, right? If you develop your own, and it's we're all in a difficult place here. So these are the sort of conversations that are going on right now at colleges and university campuses and in business and organizations. And there you have it, the conceptual territory. So I'm happy to not so much if I can answer questions, but maybe engage in a conversation with all of you for a few minutes about this, what you're seeing and how you're handling it in your own work. And I'm going to open up the chat there.
Yeah, Laurie, I just was writing down some of the terms that you were using. So cultural intelligence, people mattering. There was another one in there with the word cultural in the beginning.
Cultural competence.
Thank you. Yeah, I think many of our clients are experiencing this and will be looking to us and have looked to us to help guide them. So the more knowledge that we can have around this topic from experts like you, it helps us guide their decision making and their conversations that they're having internally and how they're handling it on campus and even in external communications.
It's so interesting because I feel like we're sort of straddling two worlds now. And I did say to my publisher, can we still use my old chapter that talks about diversity, equity, and inclusion? And that can be like for colleges and universities who aren't willing to bend to the will of what's happening, right? They can still use that. And for colleges and universities who are having a tough time, but still want to have these conversations on campus, they can kind of use the other lens to look through this. And unfortunately, for the moment, maybe that's how we have to, it seems that's how we have to approach things. That's how I've had to do it in my work in the last 12 months or so.
Right. And Dawn had to jump, but I did want to just communicate. Her question is, can we get your slides? And yes, we will be sharing this presentation with the team, obviously with you, Laurie, but it would be great if we could have a copy of your deck if that's possible.
Awesome. Of course. And I think what's at stake here is that accessibility.
Right.
That's what's at stake is accessibility for all of these young people, accessibility to education, accessibility to that social mobility and getting good jobs. And so what's happening right now is very distressing from that point of view.
Right.
We've worked with clients where we've had to basically scrape their site for DEI related verbiage, and it has felt very Orwellian. But to your point about making sure that the heart of it remains accessible, that's all we can do for them right now. They're doing the best they can to still provide services, and as strange as it is, it's where we are right now.
I think what's very heartening for me, because I came up through student success, and like I said, in my student success course, there was a diversity, equity, and inclusion outcome. And this is going back 15 years, where faculty did not want to deliver that component of the course. So I had to be creative and develop this program called the Student Diversity Advocates Program. So I had student mentors that I had to train and develop so that they could go into the classroom and have those courageous conversations with students. And we've evolved from then, but I think I can see that practice coming back into colleges and universities of using it student to student, having these conversations if faculty and staff aren't going to be allowed to have them so directly in the curriculum. And now some of the organizations are adding student success to the diversity, equity, and inclusion and student success. And that's because in the student success areas, like if you think about tutoring, if an underrepresented students, or all students for that matter, are having trouble accessing their work and being successful in their classes, it's in those tutoring centers and in those spaces and places in college campuses that we can close the equity gap.
Right. Well, I see, actually, there's one more question. I see we're up against the time, but I will read this. I don't know, Laurie, if you can see it in the chat.
Yep.
Okay.
Yeah, well, I think, Caitlin, that's always been the what you've seen in sort of the last 10 years as colleges and universities creating a role, and there could be a vice president of diversity, equity, and inclusion. That was a big movement in the last 10 years. And now I think that's regressing. Those titles are changing.
Right.
So, you know, it's so interesting in these institutions and organizations. The creativity comes from working around some of the institutional politics.
Right.
It's so hard to even talk about because you're afraid if you open your mouth and say something that's going to offend somebody. So you're like hanging on, and that's where I think we have to give people grace, because I go back to that Julia Middleton thing. She's like, basically, she says, you're going to screw up. If you screw up, approach it with a sense of humor, and everybody can give everybody grace. And then we can talk about it using those restorative practices, right?
Right. Well, Laurie, thank you so much.
You're welcome.
It's been incredible.
Yes. Higher ed is my passion, so I'm
clearly,
happy to talk
we are
about
so lucky that you were able to give this talk to us today.
Thank you.
So we can reach out to Laurie. We can contact her on our website, lauriehazard.com, or lauriehazard32@gmail.com.